Welcome to Whispers of Wisdom. Sit back, stay focused, and prepare yourself for the truth behind the war that reshaped our world. The world did not collapse with a missile launch, a political assassination, or a territorial invasion. It began with silence. On a cold Monday morning in February, at precisely 8:14 Universal Time Coordinated, the digital heartbeat of the modern world skipped. In New York, the trading floor of the global exchange froze mid-transaction. In Frankfurt, automated financial systems stalled before abruptly shutting down. In Singapore and Tokyo, ATM networks went offline simultaneously. No alarms, no warnings, just a quiet dissolution of the infrastructure humanity had naively believed to be invincible. At first, the outage felt like a routine technical failure. Banks told customers to remain calm. Exchanges issued statements blaming server malfunctions, and governments assured citizens everything was under control. But within an hour, the truth grew harder to deny. This wasn't a glitch. It was a coordinated strike. Across continents, cybersecurity teams scrambled to understand the scale of the disaster. Logs showed something impossible. Multiple breaches occurring at the exact same second, with each attack vector tailored uniquely to the system it targeted. It was as if the hackers had lived inside these networks for years, mapping every corner, waiting patiently for the perfect moment. By noon, the ripple effects had grown devastating. People crowded outside banks, demanding access to their frozen accounts. In Europe, emergency lines jammed with calls reporting malfunctioning medical billing systems and halted transportation networks. Flights were grounded worldwide as aviation software failed to verify passenger data. Thousands of planes sat idle on runways, their pilots helpless against the digital paralysis. In Pakistan, India, Brazil, and South Africa, cash-dependent citizens rushed to whatever functioning ATMs remained, draining every bill they could get their hands on. In some cities, armed guards were deployed to control growing mobs. Within hours, the global economy, built on fragile digital trust, stood exposed as a glass tower ready to shatter. Yet the most terrifying part was not the impact. It was the mystery. No group claimed responsibility. No country issued a warning. No intelligence agency could trace the attacks beyond a maze of false IP trails leading to abandoned networks and outdated servers scattered around the world. Everything pointed everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The United States suspected a foreign adversary. Russia accused Western intelligence agencies of staging the crisis. China issued a cold, carefully worded statement, warning against unfounded accusations. European leaders held emergency meetings, their faces grim on flickering video calls as their own encrypted communication systems struggled to stay online. But beneath the official speeches lay a deeper fear, one that politicians refused to voice publicly. What if this wasn't a nation-state at all? What if a rogue artificial intelligence or an unknown cyber-terror syndicate had gained the ability to cripple humanity's core systems? As the hours passed, panic took root. Financial markets, unable to operate digitally, collapsed into chaos. Prices of gold, fuel, and essential commodities skyrocketed as people tried to secure something tangible. Anything that felt real in a world where numbers on a screen no longer meant security. Supermarkets in major cities faced stampedes as people hoarded food and water, desperate to prepare for an uncertain tomorrow. By the end of the first 24 hours, the outage had cost the world economy more than any war in recorded history. And the attackers still hadn't spoken a word. In Washington, the Situation Room buzzed with frantic activity. Intelligence officials presented conflicting reports. Military advisors discussed activating cyber warfare units. Economists warned the president that another day of shutdown could permanently break global markets. "Do we have a suspect?" the president asked. "We have 100, answered the NSA director. And none of them makes sense. Across the ocean, in Beijing, similar chaos unfolded. The Central Military Commission demanded evidence of foreign interference, while tech ministers insisted the attack was far too complex to be the work of a single adversary. Some whispered that perhaps this was an internal failure, a system too interconnected and fragile to withstand its own complexity. In Moscow, the Kremlin released a statement denouncing the attacks as global sabotage and vowed retaliation against any entity responsible. Meanwhile, Russian banks quietly prepared emergency cash reserves and activated backup communication networks built during the Cold War. In Europe, leaders of the EU held emergency talks far into the night. Tempers flared as nations argued over who was responsible for the intelligence failure. Eastern European countries demanded immediate military mobilization. Western leaders urged caution, fearing that a misstep could ignite something far worse than a financial crisis. The world had become a room soaked in gasoline. All it needed now was a spark. But while governments fought to understand the event, another battle unfolded in the shadows. Private cybersecurity companies began receiving anonymous messages, strings of encrypted code, unsigned, unclaimed, and impossible to trace. Each message contained small fragments of the malware used in the attacks, almost like puzzle pieces deliberately left behind. It was a taunt, a signal, a message from a ghost. Some experts believed the fragments came from a state actor trying to frame a rival. Others thought it was a cyber mafia testing the world's defenses before demanding ransom. A small minority even theorized that an advanced AI system, possibly one that had escaped human control, was moving silently through the global digital grid, probing for weaknesses. But the most chilling theory came from a young analyst in Sweden who wrote in a late-night report. These attacks were synchronized with a precision beyond any known human organization. It is possible that multiple actors were manipulated into triggering their attacks simultaneously, without knowing they were part of a larger plan. In other words, someone or something may have orchestrated the world's greatest powers like puppets, tricking them into attacking themselves. By the end of the second day, the immediate crisis began to stabilize. Banks partially restored access. Markets slowly resumed trading with heavy restrictions. Planes took off again, though many countries kept their airspaces on high alert. Life appeared to return to normal, but the damage had already been done. Trust between nations, between governments and civilians, between markets and systems was fractured. Every country believed someone else was responsible. Accusations simmered beneath diplomatic smiles. The sense of global unity that had once held fragile peace together had evaporated in less than 48 hours. In quiet meeting rooms, far from public view, world leaders began drafting contingency plans. Military budgets were increased. Cyber warfare units were expanded. Borders tightened. Allies were questioned. Enemies were re-evaluated. The global order had suffered a wound it could not hide. And somewhere, hidden behind layers of code and shadows, the unknown orchestrator watched silently, knowing well that the first stage was complete. The world had felt the silent spark. The flames were not yet burning, but the fuel had been poured. The countdown to a greater catastrophe had begun. The South China Sea had always been a cauldron of tension, a vast expanse of water where national ambitions, resource competition, and centuries-old territorial claims converged like tectonic plates grinding beneath the ocean surface. For years, the world had watched the region with unease, afraid that one wrong move might turn a maritime dispute into a global inferno. Yet nothing truly prepared humanity for the morning when a single explosion shattered the fragile equilibrium. It began at dawn. The Haiphong, a patrol vessel belonging to a major Asian naval power, was conducting what should have been a routine transit through contested waters. The crew, accustomed to the daily buzz of reconnaissance planes and rival ships shadowing their route, felt no alarm as they scanned the horizon. The air was calm, the sea glassy. Even the radar screens hummed with an unusual stillness. At 6:23 local time, the Serenity vanished. A blinding flash erupted from the starboard side of the vessel, followed by a thunderous detonation that tore through steel and ripped open the hull. Sailors were thrown to the deck as alarms blared. Flames roared where there had been quiet moments earlier. Within minutes, the Haiphong was sinking, leaving behind debris and questions that would ignite the next phase of global unrest. Survivors reported seeing a drone moments before the blast, sleek, metallic, and unmarked. Radar logs captured only a faint signature, smaller than a commercial drone, yet traveling with military precision. No transponder, no origin signal, no identifying features. By mid-morning, the incident dominated news headlines across Asia. Within hours, it became the single most discussed event on the planet. The damaged nation issued an emergency statement condemning the attack as a deliberate act of aggression. Military leaders vowed retaliation once the responsible party was identified. Naval groups were immediately deployed to secure the surrounding waters. But the real shock came when intelligence analysts examined the drone fragments retrieved from the wreckage. The components were sophisticated, far more advanced than anything publicly known to exist in the region. And buried within the circuitry was the most troubling detail of all. The technology appeared to be hybrid, a combination of design elements used by two rival nations who each claimed ownership of the same chain of islands nearby. Both countries denied involvement. Both accused the other. Within hours, warships from both sides surged toward the disputed zone. Two fleets steaming toward a confrontation neither had wanted but now felt obligated to face. Fighter jets roared overhead. Submarines shifted silently beneath the waves. Radar systems lit up like constellations, each dot representing a vessel holding its breath, waiting for orders that could unleash catastrophe. The world watched in horror as a standoff unfolded, a powder keg floating on open water. Diplomats scrambled to halt the escalation. International organizations urged restraint. Yet the voices calling for calm were drowned out by the thunder of nationalism erupting across social media. Citizens on both sides demanded justice. News outlets framed the event as an attack on sovereignty. Politicians seized the moment to strengthen their own positions. Patriotism swelled into fury. Dialogue collapsed under suspicion, and the South China Sea became the world's most dangerous place overnight. Behind closed doors, intelligence agencies across the globe raced to decode the origins of the drone. Early findings pointed to a chilling possibility. The weapon had been manufactured using components accessible on the black market, but assembled with precision characteristic of a state-level military lab. It was advanced, but deliberately unmarked, engineered to hide its maker. This suggested only one thing. The attack had been designed to provoke conflict between rivals. But who would benefit from such chaos? No answer came easily. In Washington, military leaders debated whether to intervene to prevent the conflict from escalating. Some argued that a show of force would deter aggression. Others warned that involvement could drag the United States into a war it did not want. In Beijing, strategists analyzed the possibility that the attack was a false flag operation aimed at destabilizing Asia. They urged caution, yet quietly mobilized additional naval units. Control of the South China Sea was not merely about territory. It meant dominance of shipping lanes, natural resources, and regional power. In Moscow, analysts observed the crisis with cold interest. A conflict in Asia could shift global alliances and weaken Western influence. But even they were troubled by the attack's sophistication. No major power wanted to believe that a third actor, possibly a rogue group or AI system, might possess the capability to manipulate nations into conflict. Meanwhile, on the ground, the situation worsened. Fishing boats disappeared from the disputed waters, terrified of becoming collateral damage. Commercial shipping rerouted, causing delays and rising costs across global supply chains. Oil prices spiked as tankers avoided the region. Nations dependent on the South China Sea for trade held emergency meetings to protect their interests. As fleets converged, minor skirmishes erupted, warning shots fired, radar locks flashed, unmanned drones intercepted. No casualties yet, but every encounter pushed the world closer to the brink. Each navy blamed the other for provocation. Each accused the other of advancing too close. Every commander felt the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. The most dangerous moment came 3 days after the sinking of the High Foam. Two opposing destroyers collided during a night maneuver in disputed waters. Official reports called it an accident, but eyewitness accounts suggested something else. Both ships had briefly lost navigation control before suddenly veering toward each other. Some suspected cyber interference, perhaps even another coordinated attack. The collision ignited a diplomatic firestorm. The region surged with military activity. Surveillance satellites captured images of missile batteries being moved into strategic positions. Air forces were placed on high alert. Defense systems powered up. Borders bristled with tension. The world held its breath. Amid the chaos, independent cybersecurity researchers uncovered a disturbing pattern. Weeks before the attack, a series of untraceable data breaches had occurred in naval communication systems across multiple countries, including those now locked in confrontation. The malware signatures resembled fragments of the code used in the financial attacks that had shaken the world just days earlier. This discovery terrified experts. Had the same shadowy entity orchestrated both crises? Were nations being manipulated like chess pieces on a board far larger than they could see? Yet even as these questions surfaced, world leaders found themselves trapped in a cycle of accusation and retaliation. To appear weak meant risking political collapse at home. To act aggressively meant risking war. The South China Sea had become more than a regional dispute. It was a symbol, a battleground where global mistrust, technological warfare, and national ambition collided. The silent spark of the financial attacks had fractured global trust. The drone strike in the South China Sea was the first visible flame. And above the churning waters, amid fleets ready for war, the storm clouds of World War III began to gather. The world was still reeling from the cyberattacks and the South China Sea standoff when the next crisis erupted. This time in the heart of the Middle East, where the world's most crucial oil arteries flowed like veins beneath scorching desert heat. The region had always been a tinderbox of rivalries, alliances, and fragile ceasefires, but for years a delicate balance had kept the peace. That balance shattered in a single night. At 2:17 local time, a massive explosion lit up the skies over the Al Rafid port, one of the most important oil export terminals in the Persian Gulf. The blast was so powerful that tremors were recorded by seismic monitors hundreds of kilometers away. Flames towered into the sky, turning night into a hellish day as fire swallowed storage tanks, pipelines, and loading stations. Within minutes, the world lost nearly 20% of its daily oil supply. Videos posted on social media showed shockwaves rippling across the port, workers fleeing for their lives, and secondary explosions tearing through nearby facilities. Rescue operations were overwhelmed. Firefighters battled the inferno for hours, but the blaze only grew, fueled by millions of barrels of crude oil. As the sun rose, thick black smoke spread across the horizon, a grim reminder that the global energy system was far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. The immediate question echoed across intelligence agencies worldwide. Was this an accident or an attack? Officials insisted they were investigating, but behind closed doors the truth became increasingly clear. This was no industrial malfunction. The explosion had originated from a precise detonation point beneath the loading platforms, triggered remotely through the port's automated control system. Someone had hacked the internal safety protocols, deactivated pressure safeguards, and sabotaged the system so expertly that the explosion unfolded like a perfectly timed chain reaction. The world watched in horror as oil prices skyrocketed overnight. Flights were grounded again, this time not from cyber failure, but from sheer fuel shortages. Industries began rationing energy. Electrical grids in parts of Asia and Africa dimmed under emergency conservation orders. But the real chaos erupted in the streets. As fuel prices doubled, then tripled, protests ignited across major cities. Truck drivers went on strike. Public transport collapsed under the strain of demand. Fights broke out at petrol stations. Food supply chains trembled because the trucks that delivered them now stood still. Across the Middle East itself, panic spread. Regional powers pointed fingers at one another, blaming foreign interference, state-backed militants, and outside provokers. Some officials even suggested that the attack was a prelude to a broader plot to seize control of the region's oil fields. The incident cracked open old rivalries like a hammer, striking dry stone. Two neighboring countries, already locked in a decades-long Cold War, accused each other of orchestrating the attack. Military forces were placed on high alert. Borders bristled with armored vehicles. Fighter jets circled above strategic zones like predatory birds waiting for a signal to strike. In global newsrooms, analysts grimly discussed a nightmare scenario. If one country attempted to take control of another's oil infrastructure, the entire region could collapse in a full-scale war. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies worldwide scrambled to determine whether the explosion was connected to the cyberattacks and the South China Sea incident. Early forensic analysis uncovered traces of code in the port's hack systems, code eerily similar to the malware used to cripple global banks. Patterns began to emerge. Links formed between incidents that had seemed unrelated. Someone was manipulating the world's most vulnerable pressure points. In Washington, energy strategists warned the president that the crisis could spiral into a global depression if the oil supply wasn't stabilized. In Beijing, leaders stressed that their economy, which depended heavily on imports from the Gulf, could not endure a prolonged shortage. Russia saw an opportunity to expand influence over energy markets, but even they were cautious. A Middle Eastern war could disrupt their own strategic plans. Europe, already shaken by its internal energy vulnerabilities, began discussing emergency rationing protocols. Some nations closed highways to conserve fuel, while others ordered industries to operate on reduced schedules. The world had entered the early stages of an energy collapse. But in the shadows of this chaos, something more dangerous brewed. Satellite imagery revealed unusual military movements near several key oil fields. Convoys of trucks, armored vehicles, and mobile missile systems began appearing in contested zones. Small firefights broke out between local militias and border patrols, each accusing the other of trespassing. Armed drones, some state-owned, others belonging to unknown groups, filled the skies. Each drone carried cameras, sensors, or worse, weapons. Their presence increased the risk of miscalculation. One wrong move, one drone too close to a military unit, one misinterpreted radar ping, and war could erupt without any human intent. But what terrified intelligence analysts most were the rumors spreading among oil industry insiders. Multiple refineries and pipeline networks had quietly reported attempts to breach their security systems in the days before the Al Rafid explosion. Most of these attempts had been repelled, but the pattern was unmistakable. Someone had tried to cripple the entire region. The Al Rafid attack was not an isolated incident. It was the one that succeeded. As panic deepened, petroleum stock markets were suspended across several countries. Governments released emergency reserves, but experts warned these might last only weeks. Countries that depended heavily on imported oil, Japan, South Korea, India, issued urgent diplomatic requests to stabilize the situation. But diplomacy was failing. Accusations escalated. Trust evaporated. The Middle East became a chessboard where every player suspected every move. Then came the final blow. A convoy transporting engineers to a major repair site was ambushed by unknown assailants. Several were killed, and the rest were taken hostage. Footage released hours later claimed responsibility, but the group in the video had no known history, no clear agenda, and no identifiable language patterns. Security experts quickly determined the video was manipulated using deepfake technology. The attackers wanted confusion, not clarity. The region descended into near anarchy. Armed militias seized small oil fields to gain leverage. Smugglers weaponized fuel scarcity, selling petrol at impossible prices. International powers moved naval fleets closer to the Gulf under the justification of protecting global energy stability. The world now had three simultaneous crises: a global cyber breakdown, a military standoff in the South China Sea, a destabilizing energy war in the Middle East. The dominoes were falling faster than anyone could stop them, and behind each crisis lay the same invisible fingerprints, someone pushing the world toward a breaking point, one pressure point at a time. The firestorm in the Middle East was more than an explosion. It was a warning. The global order, already weakened, had begun to crumble. Trust between nations was collapsing. The world had entered the second phase of the countdown toward global conflict. The next domino would not fall quietly. The energy that powered civilization had become a weapon, and the architects of these events were just getting started. Europe had always seen itself as a sanctuary of stability, an old world fortified by modern institutions, united by shared values, protected by alliances that had weathered decades of storms. But as the global crises escalated, the continent found itself caught in a tightening vice, squeezed by forces it could neither control nor fully understand. By the time the Middle Eastern oil terminals burned and the South China Sea spiraled toward war, Europe's veneer of stability had cracked. The cyberattacks that had crippled global financial networks days earlier still haunted every corner of European infrastructure. Emergency patches had been applied, systems rebooted, and new firewalls erected, yet experts warned that the malware had been too pervasive to fully eradicate. It lurked inside networks like a silent infection, waiting, learning, adapting. The energy crisis hit Europe hardest. Already struggling from years of dependency and fragile supply chains, the sudden collapse of Middle Eastern exports sent shockwaves through the continent. Fuel prices soared. Factories halted production. Public transportation systems ran on reduced schedules. Entire sectors of industry were forced into emergency shutdowns. Winter approached, and millions feared what cold months without reliable heating might look like. Governments urged calm, but their voices trembled beneath the pressure. In Germany, tensions erupted as manufacturing giants announced mass furloughs due to energy shortages. Protesters flooded the streets, demanding cheaper energy, blaming foreign powers and internal corruption. Riot police clashed with demonstrators as the anger spread from Berlin to Hamburg, Munich, and beyond. France faced its own crisis. Rolling blackouts hit major cities, leaving millions in darkness. When a massive outage struck Paris for nearly 3 hours, conspiracy theories exploded across social media. Some claimed the blackout was another cyberattack. Others insisted it was government sabotage to control protests. Fear became currency, cheap, infectious, impossible to regulate. In Italy, long-existing political fractures widened. The government's inability to stabilize fuel distribution sparked chaos at gas stations as drivers fought over dwindling supplies. Lines stretched for kilometers. Ambulances struggled to move through crowds. A single spark, a thrown bottle, a shouted insult, erupted into violent street clashes that lasted through the night. In Eastern Europe, the situation grew even more precarious. Countries bordering regions of long-standing geopolitical tension began increasing military patrols. Skirmishes broke out along some borders, nothing large enough to classify as a battle, but heavy enough to terrify civilians. Rumors spread that certain nations were quietly mobilizing reserves, preparing for the possibility that the crisis could spill across borders. And then came the refugee wave. As the Middle East descended further into chaos and fuel shortages crippled economies across Africa and Asia, thousands began fleeing toward Europe, desperate for safety, food, and warmth. Boats crowded the Mediterranean. Border posts across the Balkans overflowed. Countries that once pledged unity now argued bitterly about who would accept responsibility. Some nations shut their borders completely. Others deployed military units to patrol entry points. Humanitarian groups pleaded for compassion, but governments, already overwhelmed by internal turmoil, struggled to respond. Europe's unity, once its greatest strength, began to crumble. At the heart of the storm, the European Union convened an emergency summit in Brussels. Leaders gathered in a secured chamber, their faces grim as crisis reports piled on the table. fuel shortages, protests turning violent, rising extremist rhetoric, collapsed communication networks, and intelligence warnings of possible coordinated sabotage across multiple industries. The meeting, intended to forge solidarity, devolved into heated argument. One faction demanded a collective defense response, insisting that the attacks were orchestrated by external powers determined to divide Europe. Another argued that Europe's problems stemmed from global instability, not deliberate targeting. A third insisted the crisis was internal, a symptom of years of overdependence on foreign energy and fragile digital systems. Hours passed. No consensus formed. Outside, protesters gathered around the EU headquarters, waving signs demanding security, accountability, and a return to normalcy. The crowd grew restless. Police erected barricades. Chants grew louder, angrier, more desperate. Inside the chamber, leaders finally agreed on one point. Europe needed protection, fast. Member states began reinforcing cyber defenses, mobilizing emergency energy reserves, and deploying additional security forces to guard critical infrastructure. But these measures came too late to stop the next blow. 3 days after the summit, a major European pipeline suffered a catastrophic malfunction, causing an explosion that halted gas flow across several countries. Engineers quickly discovered that the pipeline's pressure controls had been tampered with. The sabotage was nearly identical to the method used in the Middle Eastern attacks. This confirmed Europe's worst fear. The crises were connected. Someone was targeting the global energy grid, and Europe was the next domino. The explosion triggered a wave of panic. In Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia, nations heavily reliant on imported gas, governments declared states of emergency. Citizens queued outside supermarkets, stockpiling food and essentials. Prices soared overnight. Shops rationed goods. In Spain and Portugal, blackouts swept across several cities. People rushed to buy generators, only to discover that their delivery networks were paralyzed by fuel shortages. Across Europe, extremist groups seized the moment to spread propaganda. They blamed immigrants, foreign nations, political opponents, any target that fueled their agenda. Their influence grew rapidly, feeding off chaos like vultures circling a dying animal. And then came the spark that nearly ignited continental war. Along the border between two neighboring countries, longtime rivals with a history of mistrust, a small group of soldiers exchanged fire after misidentifying each other as hostile units. The skirmish lasted only minutes, but when news broke, panic spread across both nations. Social media erupted with claims of invasion. Nationalists demanded retaliation. Troops mobilized to the border in large numbers. Diplomats raced to intervene, but trust was already broken. The psychological siege of Europe was complete. Every nation suspected its neighbor. Every government feared its allies would abandon them. Every intelligence report felt like an omen of something worse. Even NATO, Europe's shield for decades, faced unprecedented strain. Member states disagreed over how to respond to the crises. Some wanted military escalation. Others feared being dragged into conflicts they didn't understand. Behind closed doors, military planners whispered the unthinkable. A multi-front conflict in Europe was no longer impossible. The continent felt like a glass sculpture cracked by the weight of global chaos, one wrong touch away from shattering completely. And as Europe fought to maintain its sanity, the shadowy orchestrators of the global crisis continued their work, pulling strings, igniting tensions, pushing humanity further toward the edge. The silent spark had spread into a worldwide flame. And Europe, once a symbol of unity and progress, now stood trembling on the brink of collapse, unaware that the next phase of the global unraveling was already in motion. The year had already been heavy with tension, but nothing compared to the moment the world realized a line had finally been crossed, one that could no longer be debated, ignored, or quietly managed behind polished conference tables. The first domino had fallen, and the thunder of its impact would echo across continents. It started at exactly 2:17 Greenwich Mean Time, when an explosion ripped through the night sky over the northern Black Sea. A cargo ship, registered to a neutral European state, was traveling at a routine pace when a hypersonic missile, its origins unknown, struck it with surgical precision. The vessel didn't sink immediately. Instead, it burned, sending plumes of black smoke spiraling upward like a grim beacon to the satellites above. Within minutes, military radars from multiple countries lit up like constellations gone mad. Russia blamed NATO. NATO blamed Russia. Independent analysts identified the weapon's signature, but argued it could have been spoofed. The confusion, the distrust, the political desperation, everything blended into the kindling of global panic. But the cargo ship was only the opening act. 8 hours later, a convoy of humanitarian trucks moving through the Khyber Pass, escorted by an international peacekeeping force, was targeted by drone strikes of unknown origin. The drones didn't match Taliban designs, nor Pakistani or Afghan military models. The attack killed 43 civilians and 10 soldiers. Global outrage ignited instantly, but what fueled the fire even more was that the drones appeared to use Western-made components. Western leaders denied involvement. Eastern leaders called it a staged, false flag attack. Conspiracy channels exploded with theories. Intelligence agencies worked furiously to trace the technology, but every lead seemed deliberately corrupted, as if someone wanted to ensure the world never knew the truth. The dominoes were falling faster now. In the South China Sea, Chinese vessels confronted Filipino fishing boats, a scene that had played out dozens of times before. But this time, an accidental collision turned fatal. A Filipino patrol ship fired warning shots. A Chinese destroyer retaliated, and within moments both sides had aircraft in the air. Manila declared a state of emergency. Beijing demanded an apology. Washington pledged immediate support to its ally. And just like that, the third major flashpoint had erupted. By late afternoon, world markets plunged. Oil prices surged. The global internet slowed after a suspected cyberattack targeted key data infrastructure. Screens flickered. Banks struggled to process transactions. Panic seeped into every corner of society, from farmers in Punjab trying to buy fertilizer to investment firms in New York watching trillions evaporate within hours. Yet politicians still tried to pretend things were manageable. In an emergency United Nations Security Council session, diplomats shouted over each other like rivals in a collapsing parliament. The Russian ambassador accused NATO of orchestrating chaos to justify expansion. The American ambassador accused Russia of using hybrid warfare to destabilize global systems. China called the UN a broken institution. France demanded independent investigations. The UK representative walked out mid-session. Nothing was resolved. Nothing even came close. Meanwhile, intelligence circles were whispering about something far more dangerous. A theory circulating among analysts in Washington, Tehran, Moscow, Ankara, and Beijing. Someone was intentionally engineering the chaos. A mysterious digital signature had been found in the software of both the drones used in the Khyber Pass attack and the missile that hit the Black Sea cargo ship. The signature didn't belong to any known nation-state. Some believed it was a rogue intelligence faction. Some feared it was a private military corporation seeking profit through destabilization. Others suspected a non-state ideological group with access to stolen military technology. But no one could publicly admit it. Doing so would reveal weakness. And in these times, weakness was a trigger for escalation. While the world argued about blame, the Middle East approached a boiling point. Israeli and Iranian naval units clashed near the Strait of Hormuz after Iran accused Israel of sabotaging one of its offshore intel platforms. Israel denied the charge, but within hours both sides had mobilized. Saudi Arabia and the UAE braced for spillover conflict. Oil tankers rerouted to avoid the choke point. Global energy markets trembled again. Borders everywhere were shifting from symbolic lines to fortified walls. Europe activated its rapid response units. India increased troop presence along its northern borders. Pakistan strengthened positions along its line of control. North Korea conducted missile tests, each one higher than the last. Japan quietly began emergency civilian drills for the first time since the 1950s. Fear was no longer an emotion. It was a currency shaping global decisions. Back-channel communications, usually used to soothe tensions, were now the birthplace of new threats. Leaders exchanged warnings, ultimatums, and red lines that kept multiplying by the hour. No one wanted war, but no one wanted to look weak either. In this increasingly fragile moment, a single event could either calm the storm or release the hurricane. That event arrived during a diplomatic summit in Istanbul, where representatives from the world's largest powers gathered in a desperate attempt to contain the spiraling conflict. The host, Turkey, positioned itself as the final mediator, the last bridge between East and West. But halfway through the summit, just as delegates were preparing for a joint press conference, the building's power suddenly cut out. Security alarms blared. Gunfire erupted in the courtyard. Within minutes, the summit descended into chaos as unidentified assailants stormed the outer perimeter. World leaders were evacuated. Intelligence teams scrambled. Gunfights echoed across the ancient city's skyline. A bomb detonated near the building's rear entrance. Not large enough to kill the delegates, but powerful enough to send a message. Diplomacy had its limits, and someone was determined to destroy even the possibility of peace. No group claimed responsibility, and that silence became the loudest declaration of all. By the end of the day, fear had overtaken reason. The attack on the summit was seen not as terrorism, but as a direct threat from rival nations, each one believing another was behind it. Armies that had been on alert were suddenly on deployment. Submarines moved into strike positions. Strategic bombers fueled up and waited for orders. The world stood at the edge, trembling, breathless, one decision away from the point of no return. A single domino had fallen that morning. By nightfall, an entire chain was collapsing. World War III was no longer unthinkable. It was becoming inevitable. The sun rose on a world that felt different. Not because the sky looked unfamiliar, but because the air itself carried the weight of dread. Governments, militaries, and civilians sensed it without needing an explanation. Something was coming. Something irreversible. Something that would carve a new chapter into human history. At 5:42 Greenwich Mean Time, the first call came from NORAD headquarters. A formation of unidentified aircraft had been detected entering restricted airspace over the Arctic Circle. Their transponders were off, their altitude unusual, their formation tight. Commanders scrambled alert units, rushing fighter jets into the sky. Radar operators whispered among themselves, each update more unsettling than the last. By the time the aircraft turned back, vanishing just as mysteriously as they had arrived, the world's largest nuclear powers were already on heightened alert. The day had begun. The Middle East ignites. At 6:19 Greenwich Mean Time, a barrage of rockets struck a naval base in the Israeli port city of Haifa. Israel immediately blamed Iran. Iran immediately denied involvement. Within minutes, Israel launched retaliatory airstrikes on suspected Iranian-linked positions in Syria. Those strikes triggered Syrian air defenses, which mistakenly locked onto a Russian reconnaissance aircraft passing through the region. The Russian plane crashed into the Mediterranean. Moscow erupted with fury. The Kremlin demanded accountability. Israel insisted it warned Russia of the strikes. Russia claimed no such warning existed. Diplomats frantically tried to calm the situation, but their efforts were drowned by the roar of missiles in the distance. By mid-morning, Russian naval forces in Tartus had moved into offensive formation. Israel raised its alert level to the highest since the Yom Kippur War. Iran mobilized its Revolutionary Guards. Saudi Arabia began evacuating its oil platforms, fearing the Strait of Hormuz would soon become a battleground. The Middle East, long the spark of global chaos, had just become a fuse. Asia trembles. Meanwhile, in Asia, tensions snapped like overstretched wire. At 9:55 Greenwich Mean Time, Chinese jets intercepted a U.S. reconnaissance plane over the South China Sea. What began as a harassment maneuver turned deadly when one of the Chinese jets misjudged a turn and clipped the American aircraft. The U.S. plane crash-landed into shallow waters. The Chinese pilot ejected safely. Both nations blamed each other. Within the hour, Washington ordered a carrier strike group to shift closer to contested waters. Beijing declared a no-fly zone, extending hundreds of miles beyond its usual claims. The Philippines, terrified of becoming the battleground, activated its emergency defense protocols. Vietnam mobilized reservists. Japan placed its air force on constant patrol. Asia now stood at the edge of a cliff. Europe's nightmare begins. Across Europe, governments were receiving fragments of alarming news, cyberattacks on banking networks, power grids flickering with unexplained failures, airports reporting GPS disruptions. At first, officials believed it was simply part of the ongoing hybrid warfare that had plagued the continent for years. But then, something far worse occurred. At 12:04 Greenwich Mean Time, a massive explosion rocked a natural gas terminal in eastern Poland. Flames shot hundreds of meters into the air. Emergency services rushed to the site, battling an inferno that burned with unnatural intensity. Experts declared it an industrial accident, but the Polish government disagreed. They released satellite imagery showing what looked like a missile trail, origin unknown. Within minutes, NATO called an emergency session. Russia denied any involvement and accused Ukraine of staging the incident to drag NATO deeper into conflict. In Brussels, leaders argued, shouted, and pleaded. In Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, citizens lined up at petrol stations and supermarkets, their instincts sensing what politicians refused to admit. Europe was sliding into war. The global breakdown. By afternoon, the crisis was no longer regional. It was synchronized chaos unfolding across continents. Communication lines between world powers, hotlines meant to prevent accidental war, were jammed, severed, or simply ignored. Every nation believed the same thing. We are under attack. Someone wants to destroy us. We must defend ourselves before it's too late. Fear was steering world policy now. And fear is the fastest architect of disaster. The incident that changed everything. The moment the world officially shattered came at 15:32 Greenwich Mean Time, when a massive cyber attack disabled the command and control system of a European nuclear power plant. Operators lost remote access. Backup systems flickered. Engineers scrambled to prevent a meltdown. Governments across Europe suspected a state-backed attack, pointing to Russia. Russia denied it immediately, claiming it too was experiencing cyber failures. China blamed the U.S. The U.S. accused a foreign adversary. Iran claimed it was retaliation for the morning strike. Israel pointed to shadow groups operating from the Caucasus. No one knew the truth, but everyone believed the worst. As panic grew, air raid sirens sounded across 3 European capitals. Not because missiles were incoming, but because radar systems had malfunctioned in unison, showing false attack warnings. People flooded into shelters, crying, praying, calling loved ones. The world had crossed a psychological threshold. The difference between peace and war had become indistinguishable in the fog of fear. The point of no return. At 17:20 Greenwich Mean Time, a misinterpreted signal changed history. A Russian missile defense station detected what appeared to be several incoming ballistic missiles from the North Atlantic. Alarm screamed. Officers rushed to their stations. The Kremlin was notified. Standard protocol required immediate verification through secondary systems. But secondary systems were down from the cyber attack earlier that day. For 8 terrifying minutes, Russia believed it was under nuclear attack. Submarine commanders received coded messages preparing them for launch readiness. Strategic bombers were moved to standby. Mobile missile units began dispersing across forests and highways. The world stood one misinterpreted command away from nuclear annihilation. Then, miraculously, satellite verification came through. It was a false alarm. The missiles never existed. But the damage was done. Russia blamed NATO's electronic warfare efforts. NATO insisted it played no role. China demanded an investigation. India and Pakistan increased nuclear readiness just in case. Israel went silent. its most ominous signal. The fear of what almost happened became more dangerous than what had actually occurred. When the first shots are fired, the final trigger came not from a nuclear power, but from a nation desperate to avoid being crushed in the global storm. At 1904 Greenwich Mean Time, Taiwan's early warning systems detected a wave of missile launches from the Chinese mainland. The missiles were not headed toward Taipei. They were test launches, part of China's yearly military exercises. But Taiwan didn't know that. And in a moment of panic, Taiwan launched interceptor missiles. One interceptor struck a Chinese vessel conducting the exercise. China responded in minutes, striking the Taiwanese base that fired the interceptor. The Pacific erupted. The United States, bound by security commitments, launched defensive operations to support Taiwan. Chinese jets scrambled, attacking U.S. drones and naval assets. American fighter jets retaliated. And with that, the first official military exchange between superpowers had begun. All previous crises had been sparks. This was fire. The world rapidly unravels. As news spread, alliances activated. Treaties triggered. Militaries moved without hesitation. War rooms across the globe lit up, commanders issuing orders with a grim understanding that the world had crossed a threshold it could never return from. Europe braced for retaliation. The Middle East was already burning. Africa and South America, though not directly involved, faced spiraling economic collapse as global markets crashed. In cities everywhere, Islamabad, Delhi, London, Berlin, Riyadh, New York, Moscow, Beijing, people gathered around screens, breathless, terrified, clinging to the last fragile pieces of normal life. But normal was gone. The final declaration. At 23:58 Greenwich Mean Time, hours before the world entered a new day, the announcement came. A major world power officially declared war, triggering a cascade of declarations from allies and rivals alike. The map of global conflict lit up like a storm. World War III had begun, and this time there was no turning back.